Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome again. Welcome to this episode of Live with Littlewood, with me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, where each week we chart the disastrous loss of our civil liberties, the collapse of the British economy, the fact that there doesn't seem to be any way out of this crisis, and I become more miserable with each passing minute. But the good news is we have a stellar lineup of freedom lovers, optimists, crusaders, thinkers to help chart our way out of this great trouble, this madness, in my view, increasingly this madness. Coming up later on the show, we've got Sam Dumitriu from the Entrepreneurs Network, my good friend Marek Tatala from Civic Forum, the IEA's sister organisation over in Poland, Paul Staines, the editor-in-chief of Guido Fawkes, Victoria Hewson, the IEA's very own head of regulatory affairs. And towards the end of the show, we're being joined by the leading economist, Andrew Lilico, and the researcher and political commentator, Rebecca Lowe. So there's lots to look forward to, but look, let me make sure that we introduce you properly to our first three guests. Gentlemen, a pleasure to have you with us this evening. Martin Durkin, documentary maker, filmmaker, radical libertarian revolutionary. He's put together, if you haven't seen them, we'll make sure we link to them in the chat, Brexit the movie, Thatcher, Death of a Revolutionary, Britain's £1 trillion horror story, all must-watch stuff, especially the bits with me in it. They are particularly excellent, if I may say so. Martin, good evening. It's great to have you with us.
Hi there. Lovely to be here.
We're also joined by James Price. James, great to have you with us. Now, Senior Accounts Director at Hanover. Somebody who practices what he preaches, leaves the political sector and goes off to the private sector to make some filthy lucre. It's great to have you with us, James. Good evening to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And last but not least, in our early panelists, we've got Duncan Simpson, Head of Research at the Taxpayers Alliance. Duncan, hello, how are you? Good evening.
Very well, Mark. Good to be with you.
So I should have said, James, you used to be at the Taxpayers Alliance, didn't you? So we have a very, very balanced initial panel, somebody presently with the Taxpayers Alliance and somebody who used to be at the Taxpayers Alliance. So welcome to all three of you. Martin, I'm going to start with you. You're a chirpy, upbeat, everything's going to be all right sort of person. What do you make of the situation that we're in at the moment? You reside in the People's Republic of Islington. They must be loving it there, right? I mean, authoritarian socialism has arrived.
They're complete lockdown lovies here. They're like pigs in shit. So I mean, that is deeply depressing. I want to move out to Chingford. That's what I want. Well, one of my Essex mates tells me everyone is utterly ignoring everything there. I saw pictures being posted of Southend Beach. Everyone's out there having a rare old time. I am in the wrong place.
Somebody of your views choosing to live in North London, you might well reach that conclusion. But what do you make of lockdown? Well, I mean, where are we at? How do we get here? It's madness, isn't it? I mean,
it's total madness. Obviously, I think, as you said at the beginning, everyone was a bit confused because there was this. It was like watching a sci-fi film, War of the Worlds or something. There's this new thing, and it's all going to kill us, and we were all a bit disorientated. But it hasn't taken very long for the kind of the dust to settle and the old kind of the politics to come to the fore. And now it's so obvious who is in favour of lockdown and who is likely to be against it. And the difficulty that we have is we have a huge public sector, for example, who are on nice public sector wages, who are having a rare old time on lockdown. They're not too worried about it. And at the same time, the very same people and the kinds of people that we know who love risk, the same people who buy into global warming, the same people who buy into the EU, the same people who buy into more regulation generally of our lives, they thrive on risk. And here's this thing arrived, and it's like Christmas. Here's this glorious big dollop of risk. And for them, the lockdown is a tantalizing glimpse of a society which in their hearts they yearn for, where our every move is directed by them.
That's interesting, Martin. You think this is more an ideological predisposition than an epidemiological one, do you? That this is really
it's a bit fuzzy around the edges, and you do have people who are libertarians who are very nervous about the plague and all that sort of thing. But broadly speaking, you can see the kind of lay of the land. I mean, take furloughing. You know that if you talk to a Thatcherite, they're going to be very disturbed about furloughing. They're going to think, that's not just lipstick on a pig. This is like hitting yourself in the face with a brick. Whereas if you talk to, a Keynesian, someone who buys into big state, they are, furloughing is kind of a crude version of Keynesianism. Pay people to do nothing, and it'll all work out fine in the end. So that division, you can see goes along the lines that we're used to in Brexit and many other issues.
James, let me come to you. You've now fled to the private sector, but not so long ago you were an advisor to the leader of the House of Lords. If you were back in your old role, what would you be advising? What would you have advised the government to have done differently, or do you think they've made a fair fist of it so far?
Well, I think that we always forget these sorts of things. That it's very popular for the Taxpayers Alliance, and I used to enjoy doing it, giving politicians as much of a kicking as possible. And one lesson that I learned is that's entirely valid as an activity for free marketeers to do. And that there's plenty of fat to be trimmed in general across the public sector, and all the arguments we make. They are humans at the end of the day, and I forget it, and I think we all forget it. If you're listening to someone like Chris Whitty, who's clearly a very clever chap, who's advocating for quite sensible, measured things to try and do to start with. So the singing happy birthdays, you wash your hands. And I think really that hand washing campaign saw a great drop in transmission, maybe even better than a lot of the lockdown measures. And then you have the Neil Ferguson report come along and saying, if you don't do this thing, 500,000 people are going to die. I think it's right that politicians should take some of that stuff on board initially. It's just that we were ill prepared. I think the government was ill prepared at having the sort of ability to scrutinise that sort of stuff before Professor Ferguson decided to either go on every news network possible or then afterwards having his mistress round. I think it's easy in hindsight to see that it's been a problem. But at the time, I think people were doing what they did to try and save lives.
Okay, but let me let me throw a few statistics your way. I asked my team at the IEA to try and judge the risk for me. So these are research numbers, but they're not peer-reviewed or official numbers. But they are about risk. And James, I hear what you say. That at the time we didn't know the scale of the tsunami, we didn't know what the infection rate was going to be, we didn't know what demographic it was going to affect. So you might have erred on the side of caution. But here we are, 2 months later, now nearly a full 2 months into lockdown. How about this? If you have no pre-existing condition and are under the age of 19, you are 210 times more likely to die in a car accident than you are to die of COVID-19 this year. If you're under 19, even if you have a pre-existing condition, you are 69 times more likely to die in a car accident this year. If you're under 40 with a pre-existing condition, you are still far more likely to die this year from being attacked by a dog or to die by being struck by lightning than you are to die of COVID-19 in hospital in England. Now, I dare say people will, argue with those sort of statistics, and you could make the case that the number of fatalities is low because of lockdown. Of course, I accept that. But doesn't it now point, James, to the fact that the initial judgment of risk proved to be wrong? There seems to be a perennial in Ferguson's career. I don't know how many times he said the apocalypse is coming. And given that the data is in, and that we know that basically everybody under the age of 50 can more or less continue about their normal business, shouldn't the government now radically change tack and just end this lockdown?
It's normally not the scientists, but the economists who are accused of correctly predicting 7 of the last 2 crises, aren't they? I think what Martin talked about, people having their own different risk profiles. I'm in Queen's Park, and you can see people completely ignoring the lockdown, even if YouGov or somebody called them up today and said, do you think it should carry on? I'm sure they said, oh, yes, it's very important. I think revealed preferences are much more important. And that kind of early doors, wash your hands more, be more careful, companies taking it into their own hands to start distancing, because whatever the left will say, companies and businesses care much more about their employees than any government bureaucrat ever could. I think it's those sorts of things where people judge their own risk profile and are starting to ignore some elements of the lockdown even beforehand when the Prime Minister was saying, you can carry on, people were being cautious. Now people have spent 2 months or whatever it is reading about coronavirus every day. It's the only story. And people are very clever. They know a lot more about this than they would about any other topic going on, and are able to, I think, more effectively judge the risk for themselves. And I think that's something we should be really proud of in this country.
Duncan, let me come to you. We've heard from James that the best way to influence government policy is to come up with a very big number of the people who are likely to die unless they do it. So I'm looking forward to the next TPA campaign. Unless you cut petrol duty by 1p, 500,000 people will die. Produce a bar chart, and you can be pretty sure the government will jump on that bandwagon immediately. What are you guys at the Taxpayers Alliance making of this? Both the lockdown itself, which is freezing the economy, but you must fear you're going to be on the back foot, right? And that taxes are going to rise to pay for this.
Well, let's be honest, it's going to be a real challenge to wind down a lot of these current schemes. There was more data out today from the government, and in total, the job retention scheme and various loan systems which have been in place, the CBILS and so forth, that totals around about £40 billion so far, both in loan guarantees and actual spending. So that's just the last 6 or 7 weeks when these schemes have come into place. And I think also, if you look at the big picture of what Sunak was saying at the budget only 2 months ago, although it seems like a lifetime ago, the degree of spending is increasing massively this Parliament, even without coronavirus. If you look at the main measurement of investment spending, we're going from about £60 billion last year to almost £100 billion by the end of this Parliament. So the situation was pretty bleak, actually, before the current predicament. We will, of course, be making the case for some good reforms in the tax system. I think one idea which should get some traction is some relaxation of employers' national insurance, either a complete holiday, so both employees and employers benefit from a real tangible tax cut, but also changing or limiting employers' NI is beneficial, because it means that those current employers or potential future employers would think more receptively to the idea of taking on new staff. So there's going to be some targeted, or rather, I think there should be some very targeted tax cuts in the future. But yes, ultimately, the degree of spending which we're seeing at the moment is worrisome, because it's going to be so challenging to wind it down. I think we hear more and more of these stories for the job retention scheme in terms of HR managers having real difficulty actually getting employees back to the office, because ultimately, as Martin was alluding to, for some people, it's very convenient, and ultimately it's quite telling that the public sector doesn't really have furlough in place. If it was the case that senior civil servants were forced to live on £2,500 a month, I would imagine their advice to ministers would change quite quickly from how it
Martin, let me come back to you on this point. We've finally reached the point, haven't we, where we've reached the utopia where everybody just lives at everybody else's expense, right? This furlough scheme, plus obviously unemployment's gone up and up and up, unsurprisingly. I think our unemployment is now the highest in over 2 decades. Do you think it's going to be remotely easy, Martin, to unravel all of this? The great philosophical guru of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Hayek, was warned that he was very concerned that the Second World War in particular led to a huge expansion of the state. Although this isn't a war, do you fear it might have the same consequence? We'll get used to all of these heavy-handed state interventions and big spending, and unraveling them when we get back to peacetime is going to be one hell of a headache, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. The discouraging thing is that there's a disconnect between the people who are in charge and the real world. And so you have, Boris Johnson, who was at Eton and then editor of The Spectator, which obviously isn't a proper job, much like The Spectator, and writing a few novels. And he didn't have to run a garage in Epping, and he didn't work for United Biscuits. He didn't know that there was money, there had to be money coming in, and there had to be more of that than the money going out. And he's surrounded by civil servants who are in a similar vein, utterly disconnected from reality. They see the economy in a macro way, and they can see you can print money. They sort of print the money, hit the money printing button like one of those lab rats hooked on cocaine, and they don't. And so they come in. They're still talking about HS2. They're going to spend this and they're going to spend that. But one encouraging thing I think is that that's wearing thin. Even millennials, I think, even university-educated millennials, who must be, the thickest of the thick, are getting that furloughing doesn't make sense. You can't have an entire country who is a large portion of which is consuming but not producing. It simply does not make sense. And you have a lot of my kids' friends are really, really worried. So I think that this, the way Boris came in and there was all this big talk of spend, spend, spend. I think that's now really worrying people. And happily, I think it's unwinding. But it's one thing for it to unwind in the country as a whole and for the people to be cynical about government largesse and the statements of government experts and the rest of it. It's another thing, the establishment. I mean, where are they going to carry on?
But every good revolution starts with a good bout of public cynicism, right, Martin? I mean, we've got to get them cynical. We've got to get the working class cynical first.
There's cause for optimism. I think there's cause for optimism.
James, where are you on this? Optimistic? I mean, obviously the short term is going to be pretty grim, but I can't decide which way is up over the longer term, whether this is the new normal and, we're going to be back up to 50% of GDP being spent by the state. I was looking through the numbers earlier today. I think it's a bit more than half of the labour force are now on the government payroll one way or another. They're either working in the public sector or they're furloughed or they're on welfare benefits. Are you with Martin that the great British public are going to realise that this is not sustainable and therefore we could kind of do a bit of a handbrake turn and get out of this?
Absolutely. I think it is the idea that some people do enjoy just sort of staying at home, and especially if you're in the public sector and you're not feeling the bite of it all. But I think in general, people are starting to realise they actually, even sort of the more lazy amongst us, that they miss work or even they miss going and being in an office. And so I do think I'm very optimistic that people will come roaring back. The economy will come roaring back, not least because, as Martin says, you realise that the magic money tree doesn't exist. And if the Prime Minister is still saying things like there will be no austerity involved in any of this, the only solution economically is going to be to go for growth as much as possible. And there'll be no more excuses not to do the stuff that the IEA and the TPA and groups like that keep advocating for. Reagan got the growth in America in 1984 up to something like 7.2%. That would be the great thing, and there are no more excuses around it. That's on the economic side. But I think culturally as well, people are realizing how much they love their liberty. We've all taken it for granted. Duncan and I kind of at the age where we sort of were just about to go to university when the financial crash happened. But ever since then, everything has been pretty rosy. We live in the greatest country possible. And now we're being told, actually, you can't go out and do absolutely anything you want for a very short period of time. And I think all generations we're reminded just how precious that liberty is. And I think that all calls for sugar taxes and all the other crap like that, I think is going to go out the window.
Okay, that's two very upbeat people. Good. I said at the outset, I'm depressed. So James and Martin, you're making me a little bit more optimistic. Duncan, are you joining me on the depressed, pessimistic side of the ledger, or are you with comrade revolutionaries Durkin and Price here?
I'm afraid I'm pretty cynical about what's about to come. I think there's going to be so many elements of what the government wants to do, not least HS2, which obviously we've advocated against this for years. But if the government is so intent on this levelling up agenda, however nebulous and amorphous and however that can be defined, I mean, essentially it means spending a lot of money on capital projects, however disastrous they might be. Some might be very effective. HS2 clearly isn't one of those examples. If that's the mindset of the government right now and was beforehand, I would be not optimistic about some pretty well targeted reductions in public spending. But I suppose the slight silver lining, as James alludes to, I mean, there's been quite a few scenes in Wales, for example, of people crossing over from the border from England to go for a walk in Snowdonia or something, and the kind of apoplexy which people are now saying about this is quite reassuring. And I think if that level of disdain for particularly devolved administrations continues for a little bit longer, then people will realise that yes, this situation is fundamentally not sustainable. But on the public spending side, I'm not at this juncture particularly optimistic for the good wind down of some of the more egregious projects the government has.
Okay, we've got some new guests joining us very shortly, but I want the three of you to stay with us. But what I want to ask each of you is this: even if you have some sympathy for the difficult decision that the government made 2 months ago, and as I say, okay, I'm going to try and cheer myself up. It's not that everything's bad, all right? I mean, today's a nice sunny day. That's an upside. I don't think ever in my life at this time in May have I been able to say that Southampton Football Club have gone 10 weeks unbeaten. That's a pretty big upside as well. But let's also have the sunny upside of saying the politicians did the sort of right thing at the time. That Ferguson's numbers were believable. They had to act cautiously. don't you think now we've got to move away from this being law and towards it being guidance? You might very well want to say, look, it's over 70s, it's pretty dangerous out there, you may want to stay at home. But this doesn't need to be the law any more than it needs to be the law. My parents are both in their 70s, and I sort of suggested to them the other day that they might want to be careful as they're in a high risk group. But, also they probably shouldn't go skydiving this weekend. But there's not a law preventing them from doing that. There's just guidance preventing them from doing that. Martin, do you think there's been this rather sneaky, sinister sort of segue from advising people, I don't know, not to smoke too much, not to drink too much, to eat their 5 vegetables a day, to actually now being the law that you have to do things to protect your own health?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's been going to. Can I just say, my missus just snuck in and put this note under my nose. This is what I have to put up with.
Remember to send. What's it say?
Remember to sound like you care about people dying.
Right, okay. Well, I'm sure you do care about people dying. You just don't sound like you do. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely deplorable. I mean, I think that, at best, the old school 1950s kind of public information films about the Green Man, maybe, but actually, sort of as the weeks are going on, I'm wondering whether I don't resent those rather as well. I think all forms of, I'm getting more libertarian in my old age. I think it's just downright sinister that they are this. I mean, I know it was a huge, everyone was absolutely cacking themselves, and it was going to be, we were all going to die and the rest of it. But actually, government interference, even on the level of advice, I'd be reluctant to see spread too widely.
Okay. And James, do you think there has been this, we're blurring this distinction between the government advising you to do, because the key thing was this, right? The idea to make it law was we were worried that our hospitals would become overwhelmed, that if we all got coronavirus on the same Tuesday, we didn't have enough ventilators to cope. And I get that. But that hasn't turned out to be the case. And yet it still seems to be a mandatory legal issue that we're forcing people to do things rather than advising them to do things.
There's no doubt that the goalposts have changed. But I think, again, Reagan said that there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. But again, the wonderful thing is that people are reading lots and lots about this all the time, and they understand much better for themselves than the government does, and are acting like libertarians, even if they're not expressing that they are in the opinion polls. You're seeing tailors in East London, or butchers here in Queen's Park, or widget companies in Gloucestershire reopening. They've sat quietly for a bit. They've thought about how to do it, shown some ingenuity, especially pubs that are now doing takeaway pints, which is probably one of the better ones as well. And people are starting to realise that they can get and do this stuff better, and are just kind of half listening now to the daily press conferences, but getting on. The piri-piri chart of whether 5 or 1 or whatever, people understand that idea of the sort of risk profile, whatever. If it gets a bit worse, they'll go, okay, fair enough, well, we'll just have to close the shop again for a bit. But it goes down, we'll open it again. And people are much cleverer than any government diktat allows them to be.
Okay, Duncan, are you similarly optimistic about your fellow man? Well, or as the people, at least the fellow men with James in Queen's Park, and the fellow men that Martin yearns to be with in Chingford, even if he loathes the people who are surrounding him in Islington. What do you make of people, if you like, quietly rebelling through a revealed preference?
I'm pretty happy about that, and I think actually a lot of what was announced, I think it was last Sunday by Boris, and then the legislation subsequently changed in England, was effectively just following behaviour anyway. I mean, the demands for be able to move around and travel and basically exercise where you want to was pretty much happening. I mean, it's very anecdotal, but I live next to a lovely park in East London. I mean, there were many people sort of regularly flouting the prohibition on households to meet together just for a drink or just a chat in the park or something. So I think actually the nature of what's changed with the statutory instrument, which enforces these distancing regulations, was really just following behaviour anyway. So I think with some, slightly more targeted, shall we say, civil disobedience, then I would imagine that would also encourage the government to go through a similar path.
The best loophole I heard was actually on this show last week from Toby Young, that if you want to meet your friends for a drink at home, then put your house up for sale and get your friend to say that they want to buy a house like yours, and then the estate agent is entitled to bring them round, at which point you can uncork the wine. So we've at least found a use for estate agents in this time of crisis. Gentlemen, stay with us. We've got two more guests joining us. Delighted to be joined by Sam Dumitriu from the Entrepreneurs Network. Good evening, Sam. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Pleasure to have you on the programme. Great delight to have you with us. I'm hoping Sam's there. Can you hear us loud and clear, Sam?
I can.
Good.
See now. Right.
And Marek Tatala. Marek, it's great to have you all the way from Poland, the Vice President of Civic Forum over in Poland, kind of the IEA's sister organisation over there. Marek, thanks for joining us. Good evening to you.
Good evening, and thank you for the invitation.
Sam, let me start with you. You're from the Entrepreneurs Network. How bad is this crisis for entrepreneurialism? We were just touching on sort of people finding ways to imaginatively, I wasn't going to say get round the rules, but to reinvent themselves in a necessary way to deal with the prevailing crisis and the regulatory system. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about entrepreneurialism in this crisis and afterwards?
Well, it's a mixed bag because we've seen great cases of entrepreneurial ingenuity. We've seen people, we've seen drinks companies make hand sanitizer. We've seen people adapt and innovate. And if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, we've seen loads and loads of different new projects spring up, loads of different teams racing to find either a cure or a vaccine. So in that sense, it's quite heartening. But in general, I think recessions, they can have a negative impact on some of the most innovative forms of entrepreneurship. So we saw one study that said that if you look at businesses founded during a recession who are going for venture capital funding, they tend to be more successful on average, but the ones who are successful tend to be less innovative than the ones who are successful when the economy is absolutely booming. So some people might. So apparently, the issue is that the venture capitalists don't take as many risks at this time. So some of the big moonshots might not happen at this period of time. But we'll still see a lot of entrepreneurial ingenuity, I think.
Marek, give us this programme increasingly turns into an hour and a half of me asking my friends to give me some information to cheer me up with. Is there anything that you can tell us from Poland that is that could cheer us up? Are you dealing with the lockdown in a smart way, or do you fear for the future of Polish liberties and the Polish economy?
I think I will not be very optimistic. We are opening the economy now, but it's still very slow, and I think there is a huge problem with targeting the policies. We copied in the past policies of other countries, so we close almost everything. Since this Monday, we can go to the restaurants, we can got a haircut. I did it on Tuesday. So services are slowly recovering, but they're almost empty. I visited a few shopping malls and I walked through the streets, and many people were hoping that after opening the economy, people will immediately go into pubs and restaurants and shopping malls. And I think a lot of people are scary or uninterested in shopping now. Also with worse economic situation, I think going to restaurants or pubs may not be your first choice, meaning you're spending. So it will take a lot of time to go back to normal. Unfortunately, the government is talking all the time about the new normal, and I am very scary about these slogans of the new normal, because it may be a new normal with much more restrictive civil liberties and much bigger government.
Okay, well, that's interesting, Marek. You're sort of implying that even if the restrictions are relaxed, so it's no longer a prohibition that you can go and buy a pint of beer or eat in a restaurant, there might not be the cultural appetite to do so. So we stay with a sort of slow economy and no bounce back, not because the government is enforcing that in some sort of self-induced coma, but just because people are now so scared and nervous, they're not willing to snap back to normal. Is it as bleak as that?
Yes, and it's also connected to restrictions that are still present. To go to the restaurant, you have to sit 2 meters from other people. The staff is wearing, outfits like surgeons, like hospital doctors, and it's not the comfortable place to eat your lunch or dinner and go for a date. So I think this environment is not friendly for recovery, and it will take time after these restrictions will be lifted. The question is whether all these restrictions make sense. In Poland, you can only go to the restaurant and sit in the same table with people that you live together with, but it's not. There is no way for owners of restaurants to verify this, whether this person is your wife, fiancé, girlfriend, or just friends. So sure. There are a lot of restrictions that are really stupid and impossible to enforce. And I'm worried that will scare a lot of people and see many people staying in their homes and not going out, just not only because of policies, but also because of being worried about the whole situation.
Okay, I'm going to go back to our original 3 panelists now and ask them if there's any country in the world they would point to who they think have got it right or have got it less wrong than the others. Do you greatly admire the President of the United States with his great advice that we inject ourselves with Dettol? Have you in fact injected yourself with Dettol? Have you found that has improved or worsened your condition? Have you, like me, started to take a big interest first in the Belarusian Premier Division, but now, fortunately, I can actually watch the German Bundesliga as that's just started up again. Where can we look for inspiration? Who should we be emulating? James Price, let me start with you. Where across the Western world do you look to as the people who got it right, or not necessarily even the Western world?
Yeah, it's interesting. And the thing you get at the moment is people obviously will mention Sweden as the kind of great outlier. And the Netherlands started that way as well, I think, in the same way that Britain almost did before we were sort of shunted into going down more of a lockdown route. But we think about those things and then talk about Britain getting uniquely the worst case of anything possible and the worst care home deaths. Well, I think the numbers came out that actually UK care home deaths were a lot less bad than a lot of the rest of Europe. And we just got very, very insular at reporting anything that isn't Trump talking about Dettol or Sweden. You're not talking about all the massive anti-lockdown protests that were happening in Germany and all kinds of other, like there were hundreds of thousands of fines being sent out by the French for people breaking lockdown and those kind of things as well. And I think in general what it shows is that the idea of having kind of nation states where you could have these sorts of little experiments play out is really effective. I don't think we're going to be able to know who's done this well until a long time into the future. New Zealand is going to go for no cases, but presumably then they won't be able to open up to other countries for a long, long time.
Martin, who's got this right? I gather still in North Korea there isn't a single reported incident of coronavirus, right? As the dear leader got it right.
I think that really one of the horrible things is I can't think of anywhere that I would want to escape to, and one of the really sinister things about this is often when something horrid happens, at least in the back of your mind, you think, I can get on my motorbike and head for the Channel Tunnel and head off, or I'll go to America, or I'll go somewhere else. But one of the really horrible things looming in the background is that there is no escape. We're getting a little taste of what a world government might be like when you have international coordination on this or whatever other issue, and there's no escape. I think that's really incredibly, it's a really sinister aspect of this thing for me. I really, you have the Theresa Mays and all these other people who are always, Tony Blair, who's always calling for increased international cooperation on this issue, that issue, the other issue. I think we should be deeply, deeply skeptical and worried when people like that make those calls and get their way.
Okay, and Duncan, who are you looking to as the great inspiration that we should follow, that the Taxpayers Alliance can just cut and paste into its next policy pamphlet for what the British government should do?
Well, I'd probably look to the Swiss. I think they've done it particularly well. I think they had a pretty punitive lockdown, but not quite as punitive as ours. And the way that they've done a couple of things, for example, the equivalent of the CBIL system, which is basically the loans to companies, theirs was much more effective. The reason for that is because there was direct involvement by the banks from the get-go, rather than a few mandarins sitting in treasury in Bern. And added to which, I think some of the most aggressive restrictions that we have on our liberty in terms of seeing our loved ones, that's, I think, almost completely dissipated. I think, for example, grandparents are almost encouraged to go and see their grandkids now. So they've managed pretty well. I think the death rate has been basically on par with the rest of Europe, and indeed lower than ours. So as one particular country, in terms of how they entered it, how they're offering pretty effective support to businesses at the moment, as well as seeing a path out of where we are, I'd vote Swiss.
Okay, and Marek, talk to us about, I asked you particularly about the Polish example, but which do you see as the shining example across Europe, or perhaps not the shining example, the least dim example? Who do you think we can learn from? Who's got it right, either within Europe or indeed anywhere on the planet? Or do you fear that Martin's right, and in fact, it's a question of, everybody's pretty much following the same authoritarian path?
Unfortunately, in Poland, we are going through the COVID-19 crisis also under the government, which is capturing a lot of institutions, attacking rule of law, concentrating a lot of power in their hands. So in the captured public media in Poland, you can hear that Poland is the best. Every night we hear how great we are in solving COVID-19 pandemics, and we see a lot of statistics, some of them really manipulated messages that we are actually the best. When you look at the region, I think Slovakia was quite good, and there are a lot of articles also in English in the internet about Slovakian experience. And I think also Czech Republic is also thinking about opening much faster than previously expected. So this is some regional experience. But unfortunately, I think the clear answer will come in a year when we'll see, for example, the results of the lessons from Sweden. And I think we still have to wait for more data to make a credible assessment who was the best or the worst in policy responses.
Okay, we've got some more guests joining us shortly, but before I let Martin, Duncan and James go, I want to ask a question that's been put by Charlie Amos in the chat. And this actually references the sort of issue I was trying to tease out in my Times article on Monday. Charlie asks, should saving lives be the ultimate aim of government policy? And one of my frustrations with politicians, if you're looking at this problem through an economic lens, is they seem completely incapable of discussing any sort of trade-off at all. All you hear from politicians is, we'll do whatever it takes to achieve X. I think Matt Hancock said at the start of all this that when he was encouraging the private sector to make ventilators, that he would pay whatever the cost to buy ventilators from the private sector. I nearly changed our business from being the Institute of Economic Affairs to the Institute of Ventilator Affairs. Thought with a few toilet rolls and some masking tape, we could knock a few ventilators together and flog them to Matt Hancock. There doesn't seem to be any sense of trade-off. And obviously it's difficult, and it can sound inhuman, a bit like Mrs. Durkin worries about Martin, that you don't kind of care about human lives if you talk about these trade-offs. But let me ask each of you, do you think our politicians are treating us like infants, are too much interested in sort of empathy and sympathy rather than the actual choices? And is Charlie, when he asked the question, I'm going to take the inference that he doesn't think the ultimate aim of government policy should be saving lives. That might be an important aim, but it's just one thing to put in the round. Martin Durkin, let me come to you first.
Well, looking at our cancer survival rates, if they're really keen to save people's lives, perhaps they just should abolish the NHS.
There you go. There's a radical policy. What are you doing at 8 o'clock on Thursday nights, Martin?
Booing. I'm the only one who boos.
And James, what's your thought? You've worked in the political sphere, and I'm not trying. Politicians have a difficult job, and particularly with these sort of emergencies, but they just seem incapable of. The example I gave in my Times piece was, you can't imagine a politician saying at a press conference, "Well, we could spend £1 billion on that project, but I don't think it would save enough lives to be worth it." Even though that could very well be a legitimate judgment. They just don't talk in those terms, right?
Yeah, you're right. And by the way, on Thursday nights, I'm not booing. I'm just saying boo earns, as they say in The Simpsons. I do think it's part of the problem of the national conversation about the NHS. And I'm increasingly convinced again that when most people go and stand on Thursday nights and clap or boo, whatever it is, they're not worshipping the false idol. They are thinking about nurses and doctors and those sorts of people. But the politicians and some of the unions and things like that are thinking about the monolithic, the institution itself, and that kind of institutional worship we're seeing it's corrosive because, exactly as you say, politicians find it very, very difficult to talk about anything that might be anything other than supreme and ultimate support for that body at the expense of all other things, and expense at deaths by dangerous driving or whatever. So, the Department for Transport doesn't have to deal with our kind of slavish worship of roads in the same way.
Yeah. Duncan, what are your thoughts? Politicians and I agree, I'm frustrated that I can understand people being very grateful to health workers and doctors and nurses and all of the rest of it, not just for their work, but potentially if they're taking a higher risk as well. But politicians just don't seem to be able to level with us on difficult trade-offs. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that's about right. And I think there's numerous reasons for that. Increasingly politicians speak in a very glib fashion and just do slightly patronise this in a lot of different ways. And I think, but on the other side of the coin is that, to their credit, I think it's a reasonable point which people got, 8-9 weeks ago. We have to do some of this to increase capacity in the NHS because otherwise there'll be a degree of collapse. I remember Hancock and Johnson saying at the start of this process, well, there's no healthcare system in the world, rather, which could cope with our current predicament unless we do some radical action. But ultimately, there's pretty obvious trade-offs which just haven't been discussed. I mean, we saw unemployment figures out the other day, and those claiming universal credit. I think it's almost a million rather increase, and necessarily there'll be many problems with people's mental health and depression, which will arise in the coming months, which will eventually be picked up. And ultimately, if we're not addressing some of the other manifest problems with this wild increase in unemployment and purely focusing on what is the capacity of particular wards in the NHS, I think that's a very patronising way for politicians to discuss it.
Sam, before I bring in our new guests, let me ask you, Sam, what you want politicians to do. Your aim is to encourage entrepreneurialism. What are you praying to hear at the next Downing Street press briefing that would bring joy to your heart and your network that entrepreneurialism was going to get properly boosted in the weeks and months ahead?
I think there's a few things. First, you've got to look at the sort of investment that's going to flow into early stage businesses. So one problem is pension regulations mean that a lot of your pension savings, they're only invested in big companies, but they could actually generate quite a big return investing in venture capital. And regulations prevent people from doing that at the moment. But in theory, I think in the US at least, we've seen lots of where their pension regulations are a bit looser and allow that. There's a lot more investment into early stage entrepreneurial businesses. Tax reform is another one, making the tax system less distortive and less trying to favour certain activities over the other, and keeping taxes on business low, which will be very important in the coming years as we want to recover. And finally, making sure regulation is simple. And making sure that regulation in new sectors, one of the things we've seen during this recent crisis is that regulation has impeded a lot of good entrepreneurial innovations. It was only when Rob Jenrick decided that every restaurant should be able to become a takeaway that certain businesses really had a hope of surviving this thing. So there is a lot we can do in that area. We need to make sure that regulations are simple and open to entrepreneurial innovation. Okay, listen, guys, you've cheered me up a little in this first 45 minutes. There is a kind of burning flame of liberty still in the British people, and perhaps we will see an upswing, and there are good lessons to be learned, and perhaps we shouldn't be too harsh on our politicians, but as James pointed out, it is the job of think tanks to hold their feet to the fire and give them a bit of a kicking. Martin, Duncan and James, thanks very much for being our guests this evening. Great pleasure to have you. Stay safe, stay free, keep the flame of freedom flying high, especially in Islington, Martin. Easier job in London, I think. Well, in the other parts of London, not that easy, but an easier job. Been great having the three of you on. Thanks a lot. We'll have you back soon. Have a great evening. Marek and Sam, please stay with us. And we're going to be joined now by the IA's very own Victoria Hewson. She's the head of our regulatory affairs unit.
Good evening to you, Victoria. Great to have you with us. And Paul Staines, who is the editor-in-chief of the Guido Fawkes website, which I'm sure is known to all of you. In fact, this very program's been advertised on it continually. Paul, good evening. Glad to see you're now advertising on IEA with the Guido Fawkes logo in your...
It's an infinite loop of promotion, isn't it, going to be, Mark, today? Good to be here.
And Victoria, good evening to you as well.
Hi, Mark. Hey, everyone.
Now, what I want to get on a bit questions of liberties and how we get out of this, and particularly track and trace. And I'm going to start with you, Victoria. You've written quite a bit about this and have raised some libertarian concerns about it, some civil liberties concerns about it. To explain in layman's terms to a technophobe like me what the government's plan is, why we should be worried about it, and if we thwart it, what the hell else do we do in order to end this goddamn lockdown?
Well, so track and trace, there's basically two ways of doing it. You can do it the old-fashioned way with people, a manual process where anyone who has symptoms or is tested positive will go and speak to someone and will tell the story of where they've been and who they've been in contact with over the past relevant period. And then those people will use various resources to try and track down who they might have been in contact with and tell those people to in turn isolate themselves and get tested. And obviously that's quite a painstaking process, especially when you're talking about cases in the hundreds of thousands. And originally that's what the UK was trying to do, but we just got swamped very quickly and couldn't keep pace using manual processes. Other countries, most sort of successfully often remarked on are countries like South Korea, which have used technological solutions like apps on phones, which will use Bluetooth and location tracking to identify everybody who someone's been in contact with. So then if that person tests positive, you've got a record on their phone of everyone who they've been in proximity with over that period. The UK government has been trying to develop our own version of that. It has to be said, not massively successfully. We decided to develop our own from scratch rather than using an API that Google and Apple had developed. And it's been trialled in the Isle of Wight. And I gather the trial hasn't gone stupendously well, although the government is saying that it's had some success and very high uptake. In fact, they've delayed the rollout nationally for various reasons, including, as you alluded to, privacy concerns. They haven't published data protection impact assessment. They really haven't been very clear as to what safeguards will be involved, so that it's really quite substantial set of data about everybody's health status and the people they've been in contact with. How's that going to be safeguarded? How can we be sure that the government and the NHS, once they've got their hands on this, aren't going to use it for all kinds of other unforeseen purposes and quite undesirable purposes?
But am I right in saying, Victoria, that track and trace of some size, shape or form is the way out of this? You're just concerned about the T's and C's and the safeguards and whether it's being put together by a proper entrepreneur, somebody that Sam would approve of, or whether it's being put together by the clunky centralised state, right? I mean, but if you can overcome those civil libertarian complaints, you're gung-ho for it, right?
I'm actually a little bit more sceptical than that, because there's lots of other practical reasons why I'm not entirely sure it will work that well. For example, if you've got this app and you get a message saying you were in contact with an unknown anonymous person 3 days ago who's now tested positive, you and everyone in your house must now self-isolate for 2 weeks. I'm just not sure that the adherence to that is going to be that strong unless it's backed up with even more intrusive controls that actually monitor the compliance with these notifications that people are getting. And in order to make it really work in a watertight way, you'd have to both monitor people's adherence when they get these notifications. And actually what they do in South Korea is really quite terrifying. They don't just use this app, they use credit card payment details, they log it all against CCTV so they can identify like exactly where a person in, whether they went to the toilets in a particular building, whether they're wearing a mask. So there's and really you have to impose very strict measures to actually make sure people follow the track and trace models.
Okay, I think you will have seen going across the screen, Victoria's written a blog for the best libertarian website in the world, the IA blog. That's been flashed across your screen, and the link will be in the chat. The second best libertarian blog in the Western world is, of course, Guido Fawkes. Paul, it's great to have you with us. I wanted to ask you, Paul, what's your biggest concern at the moment? Is it about liberties and freedoms, or is it about the destruction of the economy across the world, the global economy being in the deep freeze? And is Ireland doing anything better than the UK? We've got anything to learn from the other side of the Irish Sea?
Well, Ireland is doing the same, but a little bit more and a little bit tighter than the UK. For instance, you're not allowed to go more than 5 kilometres, which basically means, in my case, stay in my county. To tell the truth, I've barely been out of the front door of the house for 6 weeks, and I quite like it, but I do live on the beach. I think other people might find it a little bit more constraining. My main worry about the whole thing is the damage to the economy. I think I can't understand why the stock market's up where it is, because I think we're going to realise in the coming weeks that the economy has been well and truly trashed, and that a lot of businesses are simply not going to be there. And in the UK, I think there's 7 million people on furlough, 2 million people who are now not working. And I would estimate, and I saw some bank analysts saying something similar, about a quarter of them to a third of them are not going to have jobs to go back to. You just saw a couple of media organisations furlough people. Well, really, they're redundant because there are no jobs going to be there at the end of it. So my main concern is the economy. In a situation where there's fire, feast, or famine, I think some religions allow you to, work on a Sunday or a Saturday, eat pork or beef or things you weren't allowed to eat. And I think similarly for libertarians, we're facing one of those emergencies where we can put aside some of our usual concerns about civil liberties. You're going to have to do something that gives. It's in your own interest. It's a reciprocal interest that I am informed that somebody I have been in contact with has had the virus. So I'm prepared to consider that short term. I think it should be a sunset in the legislation, though. My niece went back to Hong Kong, which is not so famous for civil liberties in any extent. But when she got to the airport, she had a bracelet clamped onto her that had a SIM card in it. And she was told that not only was she to go home, where she was supposed to go home, she was to stay in her bedroom. And if she went out of her bedroom, they would know. I'm not sure how accurate the GPS tracking is in Hong Kong, but that was what she was told. And sure enough, she had to stay there for 2 weeks. There was no doubt about it. And her mother was bringing food to the door because they did believe that they would be in a lot of trouble if they didn't go on the rules. So I also think I think Victoria underestimates how the British people will, to some extent, accept that there has to be some kind of allowance for the situation. And I think they will tolerate the app. And the only bit of cynicism about the app is it's been so successful in the Isle of Wight that it's delayed. And I think that means it's not working. And I'm pretty sure that their first approach wasn't the right approach. And now they're trying a second approach, which is more along the Google and Apple lines.
Sure.
And I'm pretty sure that the people who built the operating systems probably know best how to make an app for them.
Yeah, well, I wanted to bring Sam back in at this point, if we can put Sam's microphone back on again. But putting aside the rights and the wrongs or the concerns about civil liberties, as Paul states, I mean, there's barely a single sort of centralised government IT project that doesn't end in disaster. Sam, how do you think we could go about track or tracing with more sort of private sector voluntary options rather than some grand design of some bloody central planning committee in Whitehall trying to work it all out, which usually ends up in billions of pounds spent and no progress made?
Well, I think the big issue with the app is if you have privacy issues or if you have just general inconvenience issues, so one of the issues in Singapore was that it was a massive hog on your battery. The government claimed to have solved this problem, but basically I think they've kind of admitted that they haven't properly solved it. Then people won't install it. And the only way you can get an app like this to work is by making it something that every single person basically installs. You want something like 80% of people with smartphones. So I think the main thing is you have to go with private sector expertise. And I think that's probably what they've done to an extent. They've brought in people from externals. The problem is if you have your from top down saying, okay, we want you to collect this data, and then whether you get the best coders in the world, they're not going to be able to solve that problem that Google won't let you run Bluetooth in the background while you're doing other things, because that makes your phone completely vulnerable to all sorts of nefarious actors.
Okay, Marek, I want to bring you back in, and I try to get more optimistic as the program goes on. So you guys have got to help me with that. I started in deep depression, and then I sort of felt there might be a bit of resistance to the government. Oh, come on, I need a bit more optimism. So Marek, let me come to you. And this is about schools reopening, right? In Poland, I think they're not going to open until, say, the end of June. Here, the government wants to start opening from the 1st of June, but the teachers' unions don't want to let that happen, or are very nervous about it, as are a good number of local councils. Tell us what the position is in Poland, and do you think, especially with the scientific evidence we've got in front of us, that we should just reopen schools? Should be the easiest first part of the lockdown to unwind, right? It doesn't seem to add enormously to the risk or the spread of the virus, Marek.
In Poland, we are currently reopening nursery schools and kindergartens, so there is a beginning of the opening. I think the normal schools, like the primary, secondary schools, will only reopen for the next school year, so we'll not see opening before holiday. The final exams will take place in June in some special circumstances, so apart from having stress because you have to write an exam, you will probably have to do it in mask and gloves and with people going around you in clothing like doctors. Here, and it is a big problem because while we are opening the economy, we have problem of parents who have kids and have to do something with kids. And I think these things should be parallel. We also have situation when we are going through opening of the economy, but we still have serious restrictions in public transportation. And people have to commute to work somehow. Not everyone has cars. And I think these processes should be somehow connected. And unfortunately, politicians don't see these connections. They don't see these connections that are in the economy, how educational system is connected with businesses and reopening of factories and services. So I think this should be emphasized, but unfortunately, I think for next few months, we'll see kids at homes, and with also holiday season ruined, no school, no trips for children. It will be difficult also time for parents having to teach their children, but also to provide them entertainment for the whole summer.
I keep saying that one of the upsides for kind of economics nerds from this whole crisis is we're going to have an enormous data set to make comparisons between countries with at the end of it. And as far as the teachers' unions are concerned, I think they should be careful what they wish for. I mean, we're going to see what the exact impact is on numeracy and literacy of kids not going to school for 3 months. I suspect we might find that the impact is negligible, possibly even positive, in which case our approach to sort of, enforcing fines on parents for taking their kids out of school during school term might look pretty preposterous. Victoria, let me come back to you. You've struck a note of caution, both about the viability of track and trace and about the civil liberties issues. How do you think we're going to, and over what timescale, extract ourselves out of lockdown in the UK? I mean, I thought this was going to last 3 or 6 weeks. We're 2 months in now? And there seem to be more blockages in the way than there does seem to be huge political pressure to just end this all now.
Well, it's fair to say, and I think you've discussed it on this show before, that the goalpost did slightly seem to shift from flattening the curve and protecting the NHS from being overrun to now a much more generic idea of saving lives and sort of beating the virus with these five tests that we're up to now? So it's actually quite difficult to see a specific way through that. And I do think in a way there was a lot of criticism of the government for the new slogan of stay alert and suggestions that we should be relying more on people's common sense. But actually, that's not very far away from what the successful countries have been doing anyway. I'm thinking here in particular of South Korea, that didn't really have a formal lockdown as such. Yes, they closed down public spaces and bars and they shut the schools for sure, but they didn't introduce the kind of legal restrictions on movement that we've had in this country, where it's been actually a criminal offence to leave your home without reasonable excuse, and the police and people's neighbours have been enforcing that with gusto. What I would like to see is that kind of rule, that legislation being repealed, and actually people have been, if anything, have been over compliant. As Sam mentioned, people have really taken on board the risk and paid a lot of attention and have probably been over compliant as against what the government was expecting anyway in terms of working from home and all of these things. So I think relying a bit more on common sense, loosening the legal restrictions, and letting people gradually get back to normal. As I look out of my window, as they very much are, the idea of beer gardens in parks, I can tell you, has been well and truly embraced on Clapham Common.
Okay. Paul, let me come back to you, because in this Victoria very cleverly ducked the question there about when we're going to actually exit this lockdown, or perhaps people are doing so already. It doesn't much matter what the government does. But look, your Guido Fawkes is all ear close to the ground in terms of the Westminster rumours. I appreciate Westminster's a ghost town at the moment, but answer me this. Has Boris gone soft? Do you think the unpleasant personal experience he went through has fundamentally changed his outlook? It looked at the start that he was quite cavalier, and I mean that in a kind of positive way, and he now seems to be incredibly cautious. Has he changed? Has the mood in government changed? Or is this, am I reading too much into it? Or is this the civil servants capturing politicians as always happens?
Well, I was sceptical that Boris would do such a big about turn on things, but I am told, and I haven't spoken to him directly, but I am told by people that, for instance, that recent article in the Times saying he was in favour of sugar taxes to tackle obesity because he sees that as a major comorbidity in this. I'm not convinced that he will do it in the end. I think he might go down the Schwarzenegger route of encouraging more physical activity. Maybe we'll have, Big Brother style morning get fit shows and be forced to run to the office. But I just think the experience clearly will have had an effect on him, but whether it makes him change his whole world outlook overnight, that remains to be seen. Certainly, the government has, and we all know, on macroeconomic issues, shifted massively in favour of government action. But I'm hoping that people revert to how they were. If you look at the front cover of the New Statesman today, it's all boasting about how everybody's moving to the left. I'm not convinced that's going to be the case in the long run. But I do think the arguments come 2024 in Britain for the general election that you shouldn't have more state action. Well, people are going to go, just as they did after the Second World War, well, look, the job retention scheme meant we only lost 2 million jobs rather than 7 million jobs. So I think I can't see, but I hope things aren't going to change so much. But yeah, it looks like it's worrying, isn't it?
So you might make the 8 p.m. on Thursday, applaud the NHS compulsory, but you also need to do 10 sit-ups and 5 press-ups, as well as applaud the health workers, right, as part of the anti-obesity strategy. Sam and Marek, before I let you go, just your last words on whether you fear that big government will stay with us. Where 10 is you're very optimistic it won't, and as soon as we get out of this crisis, all of the emergency powers and high spending will be a thing of the past and we'll be able to snap back to where we were or better. Or 1 is you think that we're going to be surrounded by heavy regulation, high taxes and high spending for evermore. Where are you on that scale? Marek, how optimistic, 1 to 10?
I think if we do nothing, it's probably 3. But if we as free market, libertarian, classical liberal think tanks, NGOs are very active in this crisis, I hope it can be 6.
6. Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, it's good to know that the movement itself can add 3 onto the ledger. Sam, your number, where are you on the 1 to 10 scale of optimism?
I'm about 5. I don't think we're going to have a radically bigger state, but I do think we're probably going to see more spending and higher taxes on balance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a lot to fight for. Marek and Sam, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate having you on the programme. Really good to see you both. Catch up with you soon. Hope it's not too long before we can catch up and have a proper beer rather than a virtual one. We got 2 new guests joining us now. The economist Andrew Lilico is on the line. He is the chairman and the chief executive of Europe Economics and is an IEA economics fellow. And Rebecca Lowe, researcher, political commentator, formerly of the IEA as the director of our Freer initiative to spread free market ideas amongst Conservative MPs. She's joining us as well. So good evening, Rebecca.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me.
And Andrew, good evening.
Good evening.
So I want to move the discussion now to something that Paul was talking about a little earlier, which is the kind of scale of the economic damage that is being wrought, irrespective of whether you think it is justified or not justified. I was mentioning earlier, it looks like about 50% of the labour force in the UK is now one way or another on the state payroll, either in terms of welfare or furlough or public sector employees. We saw, if you believe the numbers, that Q1 saw GDP in Britain fall 5% or so, and the lockdown was only in the last few days of Q1, so God only knows what the rest of the year is going to look like. I've seen some forecasts for what they're worth suggesting GDP could fall 15%, possibly even more, which would dwarf the 2008 global financial crisis. Rishi Sunak, I think, has said, is it just today, that he is extremely worried about the scarring, the lasting scarring of this. I mean, I think I'd quite warmly welcome some scarring. That suggests the wound is no longer bleeding. I mean, I'm worried that we're sort of bleeding out. Andrew, I want to start with you. Could you just paint us a picture, irrespective of the rights and the wrongs of the policies, about what they are doing to the British economy? How bad a hole are we getting into in economic terms?
So I think there are 4 main categories of impact that we can identify here over the medium term. So first is the impact of the coronavirus crisis, the disease and so on itself. So one dimension of that would be ways in which we change our behavior in the future. We may buy more things online. It might be that there's more automation in supermarkets and so on, maybe more use of cars, less of public transport, a whole category of things like that. A second category of impacts is those associated with the vast recession that you mentioned and that we're about to encounter. And there'll be quite a lot of other impacts associated with that. So, for example, you're going to have a lot of debt. There's going to be taxes to pay in the future associated with that. I think that there'll be inflation. I think we might see inflation go into the double digits. Whether it really counts as inflation or an adjustment to the price level isn't altogether apparent, but I would have thought that inflation was the obvious way out, given the difficulties of raising taxes or cutting public spending to deal with the huge increase in debt we're going to see. So that'll be a second category. A third category, which I think is under-discussed and probably very significant, is the changed role of China in the global economy over the medium term. I think there's a decent chance that Trump will go for some kind of language of demanding reparations from China, especially if he can back up this claim that it's escaped from some kind of lab in China. And whether I see we have 120 countries, the UK included, demanding an inquiry into China's role in the crisis, I think it's quite likely we will see increased tariffs onshoring of various activities, and maybe the displacement of China from the global economy. That will have a particular impact on the European Union. The European Union, first of all, it buys a lot of Chinese consumer goods, but also there's quite a lot of use of intermediate Chinese goods. So, for example, the Germans use lots of Chinese factory parts in making their own things. And the fourth category is the impact on British politics. So one aspect of that is that the established coalition, which had placed Boris Johnson extremely strongly versus Jeremy Corbyn, has rather been disrupted. We have a new one for now. We have almost sort of North Korean levels of support for the government's lockdown, but I don't expect that to last much longer once we get into the proper recession phase. And the kind of coalition of support that he had and things associated with that, like what would happen post-Brexit with the FTA. I don't think there's going to be any FTA with the European Union now. I think that's pretty clear. So those, much of the political impact, HS2, what's going to happen about sugar taxes, what's going to happen about the balance of taxes and spending, all Boris's various infrastructure schemes, bridges to Northern Ireland are probably, alas, off the agenda for now. So that kind of, I think they're quite profound impacts on British politics. So those would be my four things to get us going.
And do you have a sense, are you willing to put a rough number on how badly you think GDP will contract over the total of 2020?
I mean, our best case scenario was a contraction of about 10% of GDP during the period of the lockdown itself. So we estimate something about getting on for 20% of GDP in periods of lockdown if it became extended over time. So I think we're talking about something which is totally unprecedented in our experience if it lasts any length of time. Now, it could well be that we find some therapy and so on, and then once we get into the autumn, we start to recover. If we were to resolve this quickly, I think some of those period impacts would then be exaggerated because the economy would run hot in the immediate period afterwards and catch up. So we'd all suddenly go on our holidays and we all rush to the shops and buy things and what have you. But so I think that but if it keeps going, there'll be very considerable scarring. I think that it might take a whole decade for the economy really to recover.
Okay, so this plan of this hour and a half to act as therapy to cheer me up has just run straight into the buffers as soon as we got Andrew Lilico on. That's not cheer me up at all. Rebecca, what do you think the outlook is for the economy? How bleak?
Well, yeah, Mark, I'm not sure I'm going to be cheering you up massively. I think largely because I certainly agree with the last point that Andrew made, which is it's just really, really, really impossible to know because we just don't know. To be able to assess something, you need to know the point at which you can assess it, and we don't know when that's going to be. We don't know what the economy is going to look like. We don't know what might be able to be done to help, if anything, or what we should be doing as individuals. And I think that's largely because, and I think various people have intimated at this throughout this episode, is that really the problem here is COVID-19, right? I mean, there are obviously costs to the things different states are doing to try to mitigate COVID-19's problems, but until there's some kind of solution to the fact that we've had 55,000 excess deaths, it's very hard to see how we're going to be able to return to anything like normal. So I imagine we're going to have kind of undulating period in which people start to go out and maybe go back to work a bit, and then if that death rate goes back up again, it won't just be because the state is telling you to stay in that people will be staying in. I mean, if the state to me said tomorrow you can go and visit your 101-year-old grandmother, Rebecca, I'm not going to do that until I'm personally convinced that I'm not going to be increasing the risk to her. And that's the thing, because it's not just about individual risk, it's about the risks that we increase by kind of agglomeration effects with our own individual activity. So, I mean, I just think it's very, very hard. I mean, we can talk for sure about the kinds of damage that's already been done to the economy, but in terms of being able to put some estimate figure on anything, it's not least because the things that we're doing to try to prevent the spread of coronavirus is a very serious disease.
Sure.
Unfortunately, the kinds of things which are going to suppress economic activity. That's why it's unprecedented, right?
I get that. So yeah, I can quite understand that voluntary actions might continue to suppress economic activity. But what you're saying there seems to suggest that you're worried about extreme risk adversity around economically active things. I mean, in economic terms, it doesn't really matter whether you visit your 101-year-old grandmother. It might matter to you emotionally, personally, and all that sort of stuff. But from what I can see of the numbers, really, we're overreacting to people of working age getting together again. I mean, they're just the risks are just not high, right?
So, I mean, I think in classic terms, whether I visit my granny does actually have a massive economic impact, because it's the kind of factors that are going to go into my decision. Not just in terms of just that one specific thing. I have to get on the train to go and see her. I might buy a sandwich en route. You know, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, obviously there are going to be impacts, and then you've got to times that across the 70 million people in the country. But the same kinds of factors are going to go into the decision making of, you know, there's the small business owner down my street who at the moment hasn't got his employees coming in, and even when the state says that he can, he might think, well, you know, one of them's 72, and or one of them has a wife with cystic fibrosis. You know, I mean, unfortunately, I think we cannot take these things outside of an economic assessment, although, of course, there are things which you might not traditionally call economic, which are going to go into your decision-making side.
Okay.
I think it's impossible. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, let's. We've always said at the IEA, forecasting is damn near impossible anyway. I mean, other than a broad brush. And Andrew, I think, gave us a very helpful broad brush picture. Let me bring Paul Staines back in, because what I want to get into now in the last few minutes of the programme is what sort of remedies might the government reach for? So although we don't yet know whether GDP's backwards 10%, 15%, 20%, whether unemployment's going to be 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, whether inflation's 5%, 10%, you know, we know the picture's going to be bleak. But Paul, what do you think? What's your instinct about what the government will do? You know, will they continue to try and pull spending levers, or will the cupboard be bare? You know, I mean, people are asking for government expenditure as a solution to this next year or the year after. I mean, surely there isn't much left to spend, or do you think they will be fiscally hawkish and go for tax rises to try and minimise the deficit, or do you think they'll go for, I don't know, a bonfire of red tape? What levers can they pull? Or what levers will they pull to try and get, you know, GDP growth running again?
Boris wants to spend. He wanted to spend before this happened, and he was opening the floodgates to spending on infrastructure and such like. He wants the big projects. You know, he wants all the legacy and things that to be seen in the future that people look back on and see him as like as one of the great Victorians who built things. Now he has a absolute fantastic excuse to spend. I think they will do that. Whether they'll balance that with tax rises or spending, I think it'll go on borrowing. I think that's a logical situation. We are in a situation where the gilt yields went negative, I think, in the last couple of days, or are going negative. So borrowing seems the way forward. And in that way, you amortize the cost of COVID-19 over the next 50 years and the next two generations. So I think that will be his instinct.
And what would your prescription be? What's Guido Fawkes going to argue for? Do you think people of our mindset should be a bit more dovish on the debt and the deficit in order to make sure that taxes don't go up and stymie growth? You know, should we stop worrying so much about the budget deficit and worry instead about the tax take? And if, you know, debt and deficit needs to take a strain, so be it.
Mark, you know the most famous quote about the deficit. The deficit is big enough to look after itself. I'm afraid that's what we're going to do again. I think the argument for putting taxes on corporations or payrolls, well, if sin taxes discourage us committing sins, taxes on corporations and payrolls will discourage jobs and economic activity. So the obvious answer is to put it onto debt. Now, I'm not sure how that plays out long term. I think there's a growing fear that the governments of the Western world, in fact, governments all around the world, will unleash inflation, which we haven't heard of this century, really, unleash inflationists to inflate with their debts. And that seems very likely. So my advice to you is to buy real things and get out of cash. Right.
Good financial advice there from Paul. Although I should say that Live with Littlewood is not a registered FSA financial advisor. Paul's advice can see your money go up as well as down. Victoria, what do you think the response is going to be? I mean, the government's going to be in a hole. Presumably, the public won't necessarily think it's a hole of the government's own making. It's a sort of act of God. But what levers do you think they're going to pull? What are their priorities going to be? Is it going to be growth, or is it going to be closing the deficit, or is it going to be to keep the spending tax turned on? How do you see this playing out over the next 6 months?
Well, I'm going to slightly play my get out card of being a lawyer, not an economist. But I think certainly growth has got to be the main lever. Of course, that's easier said than done. Every government in all times always wants growth. At the current time, how could that be pursued? Well, I think one thing we've seen, and I'm going to put my regulatory affairs hat on here, one thing we have seen throughout this crisis is various irritating regulations that were seen as holding back people from doing what they needed to do at the present have been sort of abandoned or waived. Things like gender pay gap reporting was suspended, which was very sensible. And someone mentioned before the regulations about whether you could sell takeaway food from a restaurant. Things like that. Again, the pub in the local pub in my small town in Northumberland got a visit from the police last week because they were selling beer for consumption off the premises, and they only had an on-premises license. And the police arrived in a four-wheel drive, and it was a major incident in the small town. Things like that really should just go. But they're quite, I guess, relatively minor things. If there's really going to be growth-enhancing regulatory reform, it's got to be on big-ticket items, like, for a start, getting rid of ridiculous anti-tech regulations like the online harms agenda. That would just send investment from the tech sector flying away from this country at a time when we rely on tech and have relied on social media and things like that more than ever at this time. So I'd really like to see the government prioritizing that kind of thing and abandoning its ridiculous anti-tech agenda.
Andrew, let me bring you back in. If if we're going to be in a hole and the sort of cupboard is bare to some extent, spending another 300 billion next year probably isn't feasible, but the government doesn't want to increase taxes. Do you think there is a credible supply side agenda, a cheap agenda, which might be politically difficult, but could be a go for growth type agenda? I don't know, planning reform, massive deregulation, stuff that's politically difficult, but at least has the benefit of being cheap. Or are you skeptical about that really providing the supercharge we need?
I think one of the big issues that's going to come up for free market oriented people in the short term is something which we're being a bit blindsided by and not really seeing at the moment, but it's huge, which is that the government has essentially said to commercial landlords of various sorts at the moment. So commercial tenants have been forbidden by and large from getting the services of commercial landlords. But the way the law works is that the commercial landlords are still entitled to make the charges to them. And as I understand it, there are other people who are lawyers here, but there's some case that goes back to the Civil War, which says even if the king vests royal soldiers on your property and forbids you from, and that prevents you from getting the services, you still have to pay the rent. So as I understand it, there's virtually nothing that exempts you from having to pay the rent. So in order to share out more equitably the burden of these events, which are the results of the government policy, it's said we're not allowed to have it. Why should commercial landlords be completely shielded and commercial tenants be completely exposed to that? And this is a big issue at the moment, because whereas normally only about 10% of commercial tenants are behind, at the moment it's about 40%. So there's a vast sum of monies out there. The other thing that's going to happen is a load of those firms that currently owe money are going to go bust if the commercial landlords get to charge it all for them, because they've been generating virtually no revenue in the meantime. So the government might consider passing some general law of burden sharing. And if you had a law of burden sharing of that sort, it's not entirely obvious to me what a free marketeer should think about it, whether they should be in favor of it or against it. And it strikes me that free marketeers some might even argue either side of that particular case, perhaps depending on their view of land. To what extent is land really owned, which is a question that free marketeers divide upon. So that seems to me to be a huge, we're talking about vast tens, hundreds of billions of pounds of money. And it's a question that's coming up probably in the autumn, and something that I think that free marketeers need to be thinking, which side of that particular question are we going to sit upon?
Interesting. Rebecca, I'll come to you next. What's your prescription, with us all agreeing we don't know the size and scale of the hole we're in, how deep it is, or how long we're going to still be digging it? But what do you think can feasibly be done to start to climb our way out of it? What is the free market liberal prescription that the government could deliver in the months ahead?
So I think three things quickly come to mind, which hopefully would help once this passes, but also hopefully while the duration is still continuing. And first of those is increased flexibility. I mean, we've seen particularly if you look at the NHS, which we know for ages, we pointed out the flaws of being a monopoly and a monopsony and all the other many issues with this very centralized monolith. So increased flexibility to be able to deal with very fluctuating demand shifts, I guess, and brings me also onto a point about decentralization. I mean, we've seen the way in which Germany and some other more decentralized health services have coped better. I mean, I'm a big fan of greater decentralization anywhere. I think there are kind of legitimacy reasons for it. I think centralized decision making is just plain wrong, to be honest. But I think it can much better meet demand as well. Loads of great economic efficiency arguments in terms of specialization and experimentation.
But what? Just to clarify, Rebecca, those are great, visions. But what specific rules or regulations do you want altered? What statutes do you want?
So I'd start with tax, a decentralized tax. I think so much good could be done to the country by that, and just by showing that local areas can make more of their own decisions. Actually, just to bring up a kind of a great liberalizing policy agenda, which Sam mentioned earlier. I think we're going to see a lot of companies coming out of this with very weak balance sheets. They're going to have taken on a lot of debt. Sam mentioned the idea of liberalizing pension fund regulation. There's a lot of money, particularly in those DC funds, which have amassed thanks to changes from the Pensions Act. There's a lot of capital there, which could indeed be, Sam mentioned allowing people to choose to put their pension cash into VC stuff, for instance, but also like growth capital too. So I think there's something that could be done there specifically, which not only would be liberalizing in the sense of giving people greater choice over their assets, but also could help companies, which we're going to need access to capital coming out of this. When the recession ends, that's always the hardest time for those small companies, and there's going to be a lot of recapitalization needs.
Okay, and then I want to turn our attention again. I'm begging each of you to give me some straws of optimism to cling on to. And Paul, I want to come back to you about whether there was anything. This goes to this whole bloody ghastly term about the new normal and the new abnormal, and nothing will ever be the same again. But do you think there are any battles that free market liberals might have thought that they had lost that can now be re-engaged in? I mean, one question that's just come up on YouTube is, might HS2, for example, now be abandoned? That was sort of 100 squillion trillion quid that could be afforded apparently 3 months ago. But we're going to have to start looking at these things through a rather harder lens. Do you think there's going to be some, can we get back onto some battlefields in which we lost a few limbs and lost a few bodies?
Well, the business case for HS2 is going to be reduced or by the fact that we've all learned to deal with video conferencing like we are now, and that a lot of people in business are thinking, why do I need 5 floors of a HQ building? Maybe I can cope with 1 floor of a HQ building, and a lot of people work from home and occasionally come in. So is there an argument against HS2? Well, HS2 is now statutory legislation. It's gone some way down the road. They're trying to rejig it so that it doesn't cost as much. I think maybe HS2, well, let's give it a fight, but I'm not optimistic that it can be derailed, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Things I would be optimistic on are, I think, planning and stamp duty, all those property-related things. We obviously need to kick off the property market, which is going to be a lot of trouble. So I think all those things we'd be demanding on that front, deregulating allowing planning to go forward in the green belt, abolishing stamp duty. I'm more optimistic about those.
Well, I've even heard the suggestion that if working from home and Zoom conferences become the norm, then you might actually find an awful lot of office space falls fallow, can you convert it into residential more easily? Right? Housing crisis could be tackled in some ways that way. But Paul, I want to come back to you on something which I know your the Guido Fawkes website goes strong on, and it's surprised me a little. But you rub your hands with glee every time you report one of these stories. Faith in the mainstream media seems to have collapsed during this crisis. Quite odd, right? Support for politicians of all stripes seems to be rather higher than it has been for 20 years, but people seem to have lost faith hugely with broadcasters, newspapers. You would have printed the polls yourselves. I can't quote them chapter and verse. Why, and what does that mean?
I think there was a section of the population who felt that in a time of crisis, that it was wrong for maybe the broadcasters to be not, they weren't holding the government to account. They were trying to catch them out, trip them up, be negative, find what's going wrong. When an ambulanceman comes to your house and he's running around trying to help you out with a defibrillator, you don't complain that he's not doing it right. You try and help him. And I think, rightly or wrongly, a section of the population felt very strongly that the broadcasters were, in particular, doing a bad job. And I think the press briefing, I've been in this game for 15 years. I go along to lobby press conferences and all the time see what they're like. But I don't think the general public has ever watched press conferences for a full length, as they had maybe not so much now, but originally when the crisis started and they first started doing those Downing Street press conferences. And they didn't like it. And that's why it went down. To be fair, I think the ratings for world leaders are reverting to mean now. They're going back down. And the dip in already very low esteem, which journalists are held, is basically back to where it started as well.
Okay, and so do you think, this will be a cultural change, this won't, get the economy back on track, but do you think these sort of daily, they won't be daily, but do you think we'll have these televised or public sort of press screenings? We've had them over the coronavirus, but are we going to move to a kind of White House briefing style thing? The chief press officer comes up and stands at the podium and answers questions as best they can, rather than something you've campaigned about, it being a kind of closed guild for journalists in the lobby and the real members of the public can't see what's going on.
Well, it all depends whether you think the politicians have enjoyed being televised. Some obviously do like getting FaceTime with the general British public. Others will be uncomfortable with it. Downing Street isn't that keen on televising lobby briefings. I don't know if that is because all the Prime Minister's official spokesmen aren't very telegenic, or there's another reason. They just don't have any enthusiasm for the prospect of it. I think the public would like it because they could see the raw meat being put into the sausage, but they don't think the politicians or the journalists would be so keen.
So you think it might go wider and on the record, but not, on television?
It is already on the record, but I don't think there's any appetite for it to go on TV, apart from me.
Right, okay. Well, you're a man known to often get his own way, Paul, so, who knows? I want to round up by asking each of you, and Victoria, I'm going to start with you. Again, this is my never-ending but never-quenched search for optimism. What do you think the biggest upside is going to be from a free market, classical liberal perspective of this crisis in terms of what will change? That could be something economically, it could be something constitutionally, it could be something in the public psyche or cultural. What's the most optimistic thing that you're kind of pretty confident going to happen as a result of this? Because I need something to cling on to before we wrap up this programme. Victoria, I'll start with you.
Well, I think one good thing that will come from lockdown measures being relaxed and then eventually ended is that we will all realise what we've missed, and we will value the time that we are able to spend together with our friends and families, and, frankly, even very materialistic things like shopping and going to restaurants and holidays. And I think that potentially could see a big surge of optimism as, things start to normalize, obviously you have to offset that with the continuing fear of the virus, which is going to be with us for a long time. But I think, it will make us value the things that we have when we are able to interact together and socialize together and buy and sell things to each other all that much more.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent 20 years paying a small fortune to have a seat at Southampton Football Club, and I've spent most of those 20 years just effing and blinding at my team and swearing that I'll never come back, and I can't believe I've wasted every other Saturday afternoon sitting here and watching this trash. And now I can't wait to get back. I will applaud the team off the park, even if, as is most likely, they lose 4-0 at home. So perhaps some of those things that we took for granted, we might treasure a little more. Rebecca, what's your thought about what what optimistically might come out of this that might make us a more liberal, more open-minded, more prosperous society?
I think there's probably going to be a greater focus on the need for the state to be transparent. I think that's. I think if you just think back to the beginning of this crisis, there was a lot of discussion around, for instance, kind of nudge type behavioural type policy making. Personally, I feel very strongly. I think if the power to make policy has been invested in you by the people, you need at the very least to be open and honest about the reasoning behind why it is you're putting certain things into place. And personally, I think that kind of nudge type approach is deeply illiberal. And I think we're going to see an increased need for the state to recognise its obligation to be transparent. And I think that can only be a good thing.
Isn't there a slight tension there? And this happened a bit with sort of Boris's Sunday announcement of easing the lockdown, that people seem to say, well, I want transparency, but they also want everything to be crystal clear. And you can't really have both in a complex situation, right? I mean, you sort of try and summarize things into a soundbite or something in 140 characters on Twitter because you're concerned about people's attention span, and you can't get in nuance. And the criticism was not that I think the Prime Minister was being dishonest, but that he was trying to communicate something complex. And that makes it, sort of, transparency comes across, sometimes as people who ask for it, sometimes in my view just want clarity, and sometimes that's not easy to deliver, right?
Yeah, I think you've got to make a distinction between clarity and honesty. I think somebody makes this great distinction, don't they, between precision and accuracy. And you can be highly, highly, highly precise, but you can be completely and utterly wrong. And I think similarly, what I'm asking for is honesty. And that can be manifest in good ways or bad ways. It can be in a mumbling, complicated, unhelpful way. I actually think there's an obligation to be honest in a straightforward, clear way too. But I think those are different demands, actually. Yeah.
Andrew, what's going to come out of this that's going to be good?
So I think that we've already seen an absolutely unprecedented, awesome demonstration of human adaptability and the ways in which individuals and companies and so on have adjusted to these circumstances. No government told us we should all start using Zoom. No government told us that we should spend our time baking and doing things of that sort. No government told us that we should all learn the drums and make social media things. We found absolutely extraordinary ways to adapt, to make the best of a very difficult situation for many people. And I think we will see more of that through this summer again. I think that we will see all kinds of extraordinary adaptation to the ability to operate outside. People are already playing tennis. We're going to see beer gardens. We're in Northern Ireland. They're saying they're going to have drive-in cinemas. Maybe we'll have those in other parts of the country as well. So I think there'll be cafes across town centres, and many of these things. Some of these things will be a matter of government facilitation, perhaps changing planning laws to allow them. But the vast majority of these things are human responses, a combination of business and just general human responses to very difficult circumstances, adapting. And I think that probably for generations to come, free marketeers will use some of these, the things that have happened in this period and in the years that come immediately afterwards, as absolutely paradigm illustrations of how humans, individuals and firms can adapt to even the most appalling of circumstances. And those will be very valuable examples for us.
Okay, that's pretty upbeat. Paul, give us something that rivals that for upbeat optimism. And then just before we close, I also want, which I'll start with you, Paul, your number out of 10 for how optimistic you are. I have this perfect barometer operating on panel optimism, but what are you most optimistic about and what's your aggregate number out of 10?
Long term, I'm still 10 out of 10. I think technology will solve problems and the virus will be dealt with within a couple of years. Either we'll have a therapy or we'll have a vaccine, or it will peter out. There's one thing I wanted to say from previous comments. In the words of Ryan the plumber, does everyone really need a handbook to know what they've got to do? I don't think they do. I think most people could figure it out. Maybe it's complicated for a Times leader writer, but if a plumber can see that you can figure out what you're going to do, I think that's pretty straightforward.
And you're a 10 out of 10 for long-term optimism. Okay, this is going to finish well. I'm a 6. I'm up from a 4 last week. You guys have cheered me up a bit. I just want a number from Victoria, then Rebecca, then Andrew. Then I'll give the Live with Littlewood aggregate barometer score, which is, highly market-sensitive information. So, Victoria, what's your score?
I'm going to go boring 5. I'm very indecisive about this at the moment.
Okay, Rebecca.
I don't know what time frame we're talking about, so I guess in the
actually 2 to 3 years is usually the time.
All right, because I was going to say if we're talking about the future of the human race, we're going to probably get hit by a comet at some point. 2 to 3 years. Well, I mean, I think Andrew mentioned earlier about China. I've got so many worries about all kinds of totalitarian states and things. If you're just talking about the UK and the impact of coronavirus and when it goes away, I think it's probably not going away that soon. So the UK state situation in 2 to 3 years, I don't know. I think Victoria's right. I don't think you can do anything else but a 5. I don't know the factors. Sorry, I can't calculate.
Okay, Andrew, what's your number out of 10? 2 to 3 years, the United Kingdom.
2.
Optimism score. 2. Blimey, we started so well with Paul's 10.
1 would be nuclear war.
1 wod be nuclear war. So you think a minor nuclear incident? Okay. Well, we're not finishing on the. So that's 4 point. God, we're down again on last week. The average is 4.6 on the optimism barometer. 2 weeks ago we were at 6, 5.2, 4.6. You can see the way things are going. People follow Paul's investment advice. You've got to get out of risky stuff, buy proper things. All right, next week we've got to have a bit of optimism to get back above 5. Thank you to all of our previous panelists who have left us, James, Duncan, Martin, Sam and Marek. My great thanks to the 4 of you as well, Paul, Victoria, Rebecca and Andrew. Thanks very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts, even if they were not as optimistic as I would have liked to have heard. Thanks to all of you who have watched us on YouTube. Please remember to subscribe to the IEA YouTube channel. You can hit the subscribe button in the bottom of your screen and hit the notification bell. Also go to our website, iea.org.uk, where you can sign up for our free email daily newsletter, which will keep you abreast of these sort of broadcasts and all of our upcoming webinars. And if you're one of the lucky people who have got any cash to spare at all, any donations to the IEA in this time of trouble would be greatly received. I'm even thinking of making an I Fund the IEA mug in order that you can have it proudly on your desk if you are somebody who funds the IEA. But that's not a promise at the moment, that's an aspiration, but get those donations coming in, that would be terrific. We will be back at 6 o'clock next Wednesday for another panel. This time I'm only going to select super optimists to make sure we get the barometer above 4.6. But Victoria, Rebecca, Andrew, Paul, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to all of you for watching us this evening. Have a very, very safe rest of your day. Stay free and stay upbeat. Over and out.